Hello and welcome to Clash of the Dice. I'm James and I've finally got my hands on the Warcry 2nd edition rulebook. So I've decided to have a quick look through and let you know the key changes to the core rules that I've come across so far. I'm not going to go into in depth as to things like the campaign rules, this is just the core mechanics of the game. First up, visibility. The core rules now specifically state that models are not visible to themselves for rules purposes. So if you've got an ability that works on friendly visible models, it doesn't work on the model that you're actually using it for, because it can't see itself for some reason. Next up, Warbands. So first of all, the leader rune mark has been done away with. Well, the rune mark still exists, but it's now called the hero rune mark instead of the leader rune mark. In first edition, in some of the supplements, they said that you could have a leader and then you could take a second leader as your champion. Well, now you've just got the hero rune mark, which is exactly the same as the leader rune mark, but it's now called the hero rune mark. One of your heroes must be your leader, but you can now have a maximum of 4 heroes in your warband instead of 2. As long as one of them is your leader. Next up, battle groups, and you've still got your hammer, your shield and your dagger, and the main change to this is they've simplified it. So in first edition it had very wordy rules regarding how many models you had to put in each group, but now they've simply said you spread your warband as evenly as possible out across the 3 battle groups. So if you've got a warband with 10 models in it, one of them will have 4 models in, the other battle groups will have 3 models each. Game setup is basically the same. You go through the process of doing the terrain first, then your deployment card, then your victory card, and then your twist. So no significant changes there. And the Battleground sequence is still basically the same. The only difference is they've renamed the hero phase to the initiative phase. But it still goes initiative phase, as was hero phase, then reserves phase, then the combat phase. Falling and impact damage has changed. There's one quite significant change and then one not so significant change. The first significant change is, in first edition, if you fell downwards 3 inches or more, you ran the risk of suffering impact damage. That's changed now. It's now 2 inches or more instead of 3 inches or more. So more risk of actually suffering damage. And I think part of the reason for that might be the fact that the walls that they included in the first set were only just 3 inches high, and it was negligible as to whether or not it fell into the category, so that could be why they've changed it to 2 inches. But yes, now if you fall 2 inches or more, you run the risk of suffering impact damage. The minor change is how impact damage works. It used to be you roll a d6, and on a 4 to 5, you suffer 1 damage, on a 6, you suffer 3 damage. It's still basically the same, but they've inverted the dice roll. So on a 1, you suffer 3 damage, and on a 2 to 3, you suffer 1 damage. So it's the same odds, just inverted. Combat works the same as it used to, so you compare the strength and the toughness, natural 6 causes a crit, etc, etc. So that is unchanged. What has changed is the phraseology, the definitions that they now give to different weapons. In first edition it talked about the range of the weapon being 3 inches or less or 3 inches or more. Now they've said it's either a missile weapon or a melee weapon, and that's based on whether or not it's got a 3-inch range or less or more. So they've actually given it a terminology now rather than simply referring to the range characteristic of being less than 3 inches or a range characteristic of more than 3 inches. It just makes it less wordy in the rules, so a bit easier to work with, I think. They've also clarified you can't use a missile weapon, so anything with a range of 3 inches or more, against an enemy that is within 1 inch of one of your friendly fighters. So in other words, you can't shoot into an ongoing combat if you're outside of that combat, which is odd in as much as it's not the same as Age of Sigmar. It is the same as 40k, but it's not the same as Age of Sigmar. On Age of Sigmar, you can shoot into an ongoing combat. In Warcry, you can't. Abilities, there's no significant changes to how they work. It's still a case if you get your doubles, your triples, your quads, your abilities will be either doubles, triples or quads, depending on what ability it is, and you spend your dice to use those abilities. The universal abilities are the same. The only differences are the references to heroes, missile weapons and melee weapons, but the actual abilities themselves are substantially the same. And last but definitely not least is the new rules around reactions. So a brand new rules mechanic introduced in 2nd edition. And what it allows you to do is it allows one of your fighters to do something during an enemy fighter's action. So it can be used by a fighter that is not yet activated, one of your fighters that is, a friendly fighter that's not yet activated. It can be used by a friendly fighter with a weight token, or it can be used by a fighter in a campaign battle with one or more levels of renown. I'm going to ignore that last one and just concentrate on the core uses. So a fighter that's not yet activated or a fighter with a weight token. Now there's 3 universal reactions, and then each of the factions has got their own faction specific reaction, and they all describe within the actual verbiage around when they can be used in relation to an action that's being performed by an enemy fighter. To use one, it costs the reacting fighter an action in order to perform a reaction. So if they've not yet activated, they can use one of their actions to perform a reaction, and then when the fighter does finally activate properly, it can only make 1 action instead of 2. If it's got a weight token, then effectively they've got 1 action left, so they can still make a reaction, but then to all intents and purposes they are classed as being activated because they've got no actions left. You can make 2 reactions. So if you've got 2 actions left, i.e. the fighter has not yet activated at all, that fighter could make 2 reactions as long as it doesn't activate between them. But you can only make 1 reaction for each enemy action, so you can't make 2 reactions in response to 1 single enemy action. It has to be a reaction to 1 action and then a reaction to another action, if that makes sense. But yeah, allows you to switch things up a bit, and it's things like you can take cover if you're being shot at and you're already in cover. If you've got an enemy that's going to disengage, do a disengage move, you get a chance to take a swipe at him before they move away, or as they move away. Or if they're attacking you, you can do a counter reaction, which is when you are being attacked in melee, you get the chance to deal damage back. So some very interesting stuff there. And then of course you've got the faction specific ones, which I won't go into right now, but yeah, that's the core rule, is the reactions. So there we go. Based on my reading of the 2nd edition rulebook and comparing it with the corresponding rules in the 1st edition rulebook, those are the major changes for me that jump out from 1st edition to 2nd edition. Some of them make a lot of sense. Some of them are brand new additions. Some of them feel like they've just done it for the sake of doing it, like changing the hero phase to the initiative phase. It's just the changing of a word. Changing the leader to the hero rune mark, I think that makes a lot of sense too, because yeah, you can have more than 1 in your warband. In fact, you can now have 4, so that's going to be interesting. See how you cope with 4 heroes. That's you know, that's going to give you a lot of flavour if you're wanting to do some kind of narrative campaign. And by that I mean narrative stories behind it rather than the actual campaign system. I can see that you can come up with some really nice narrative storylines for your games there using some really elite characters. But yes, I'm looking forward to trying these out. Haven't tried them out myself yet. Really looking forward to getting a couple of games in, ideally with Joshua, but possibly with some other guys as well. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Please continue to like, comment and subscribe, and God bless.